Welcome to Human School. I'm your host, Dr. Patil Armenian. After 4 years of college, 4 years of medical school, 4 years of residency, and 2 years of fellowship, I thought I was done. I did my time, got my degrees, and now I was just gonna live life. Well, think again. Some of my greatest schooling has come after my formal education was complete, and it keeps on coming. Join me at Human School, where we can learn together. I'm an emergency physician and medical toxicologist working at a large teaching hospital in California. I'm also a mom, wife, sister, daughter, and friend. Whether you work in healthcare or not, you too lead a busy life. Together, let's work on how we can thrive in all of our real-world roles. On this podcast, we'll dig deep into what it means to constantly learn and evolve, to be human. Every other week, I'll share some of my personal stories, interview inspiring people, and offer tools to help you learn more about yourself. Being on the front lines in the ER, you learn a lot about life and death. And though my philosophies were born in a busy emergency room, they can apply to anyone trying to live a joyful life here on Earth. Please listen, share, and subscribe to this podcast, available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Follow me on Instagram at Human School Podcast, and feel free to let me know what topics or guests you want to hear about. And if you like the podcast, don't forget to rate and review it. Hi, and welcome to Human School. In this episode, I talked to Dr. Bernard, or Bernie Frischer, professor of informatics at Indiana University. I loved hearing about how, over the years, Dr. Frischer combined his many interests in electronics, photography, classics, and archaeology into the novel fields of digital archaeology and virtual heritage. He received both his BA and PhD in classics, followed by a fellowship in Roman topography and archaeology at the American Academy in Rome. He taught classics at UCLA from 1976 to 2004, after which he moved to the University of Virginia, where he directed a digital humanities research center and was professor of art history and classics. Since 2013, he has been a professor at Indiana University, where he directs the virtual heritage track of the School of Informatics and Computing. He's a pioneer of this new field, which applies 3D technologies to research and instruction in fields such as anthropology, archaeology, art, architectural history, and conservation science. Not content with keeping these advances at one academic institution, Dr. Frischer founded a company called Flyover Zone Productions to commercialize these 3D cultural heritage sites, cities, and monuments, and make them available to all educational institutions and the general public. For an ordinary person like me, that means I can access historically accurate and visually impressive virtual reality tours of places like the Roman Forum at home or when I'm traveling, or explore their virtual museums with hundreds of 3D reconstructions of classical sculptures. Now, business aside, Bernie, as I know him, has been my longest standing mentor, and I had the privilege of being his undergraduate classics student at UCLA, working 3 summers at his archaeological dig site at Horace's Villa, or Villa d'Orazio, in Italy. At a huge university like UCLA, where I could have easily gotten lost in the sea of students, Bernie gave me the home base I needed and introduced me to the intellectual curiosities that I carry to this day. He's a natural mentor to everyone around him, always able to balance his own work with helping his students. In our interview, I loved hearing about how he uses his intuition to guide him, and that he too is learning new lessons and has been through burnout. What can I say? Stars, they're just like us. So without further ado, Dr. Bernard Frischer. Hi, Dr. Frischer. Welcome to Human School.
Hi, Dr. Armenian. Thanks for inviting me.
Now we can go informal. Can I call you Bernie from this point on?
Please do, like everybody else, even my undergraduate students do.
Okay, great. And, I was one of your undergraduate students at UCLA, and I think even from back then I started calling you Bernie.
I hope so. I'm pretty sure you did, like everybody else.
Yeah. I feel like the first place to get started is for you to tell us a little bit about what you currently do and how you got to this point.
Well, I like to describe myself as a virtual archaeologist, and that's a pretty new field that's only developed since the 1990s. I like to define it as the study of the ways in which 3D technologies can help experts in traditional fields of cultural heritage, such as archaeology or art history, to do the same old things that they always have done, but to do it with greater efficiency and maybe to do it faster and cheaper. But it also can help them to do new things that wouldn't be possible without 3D digital technology. And of course, it's exactly those new things that interested me in the field in the first place. And what unites the new things that virtual heritage allows us to do is to bring an empirical method to the historical disciplines. And that was never possible before because if you think of your, high school chemistry class or physics, the empirical method requires either observation or experimentation. And in a field like archaeology, how can we observe or let alone experiment on ancient Rome? Ancient Rome has disappeared. It's on average 7 meters below the modern surface, and very little of it, therefore, is visible. And even what's visible are just ruins. And what we really want to do as empiricists is observe and experiment on the city of Rome, just to take that example, in its heyday, maybe 2,000 years ago. So the only way to achieve that is by making a very accurate computer simulation. And once we have that simulation, then we can make the observations, then we can do the experiments. From this visualization, all kinds of new discoveries and insights can come to the fore, things that we didn't expect to learn about, to find out about. So that's what really excites me about the new field. And to answer the second part of your question about how I got into it, I think it was by looking back, by combining two things. My hobbies growing up especially as a teenager before I went to college, these grew out of really the interests and professions of my parents' generation. And then combining that with my academic training once I went to college and once I went to graduate school. My training was first in classical languages and literature at the undergraduate and at the graduate levels. Then I studied Roman archaeology and topography as a postdoc at the American Academy in Rome. And when I was hired to teach at UCLA after leaving Rome, I divided my time equally between classical languages and literature and Roman topography and archaeology. Well, as a teenager, under the influence of one uncle who owned a cinema and another who was an electrical engineer, my hobbies were electronics, electronic music, cinematography, and photography. I had a dark room. I had a third class radio license. I started the radio station of my high school. I composed a little bit of electronic music. It was very time consuming and tedious process to do electronic music back in the 1960s. If you put together my hobbies with my professional training, you can see why it was pretty natural for me to realize that archaeologists could benefit from the new 3D technologies that came along in the late 1980s and especially in the 1990s. So I would say, that's what I do, and that's how I somehow stumbled into this new profession.
Well, that's so interesting how you combined all the things that you love into now one overarching profession that didn't even exist before.
Yeah, exactly. And I was, of course, always very lucky that as an academic, especially at tier one research institutions, I was indulged and I was allowed to grow and develop in new directions that went way beyond the job description of the position that they hired me to do. So I feel very privileged to have been in the generation that experienced the computer revolution, especially that part of it that we could call the personal computer revolution that started in the 1980s, and had the freedom to explore what this new incredible device could mean for us, how we could use it productively to do the same old, as I said, more efficiently, but also to do new things that we never really dreamt could be possible.
I remember working with you when I was at the ripe age of 17 on the Horace's Villa archaeological dig site in Licenza, Italy. And you had a digital camera. And so you wanted everything, all the finds and all the dig sites documented with film and on digital. And that was in the summer of 1998. I remember never even knowing what a digital camera was. You taught me how to use my first digital camera. Everybody around was like, why does Bernie have that digital camera? And remember, it was with a floppy disk.
Yes. Yes, they weren't very good. I don't know how many K the images had, but probably under 1 megabyte of storage. And they were very primitive, but you could see, especially applying the principle of Moore's law, that where this was going. And it wasn't very long before our cameras had 3 and then 5 and now, you know, 40 on up megabit. Do we say megabits? Megapixels. That's what I'm looking for. So it wasn't too long before the camera started having, 1 megapixel, 3, 5. Now we're 40 on up. Sky's the limit to the number of megapixels that these digital cameras offer. And I think already by the mid 2000s, 2005 or 6, that a good Nikon camera surpassed the quality of a good 35 millimeter film SLR, which we all grew up with. I remember you were a very good photographer, and I really exploited your ability as a photographer at the excavation. I think you served officially as our site photographer the summers you helped out. Isn't that right?
I was your site photographer, and it was the funnest thing ever. I got to take pictures of everything, and I loved it.
Well, I appreciated what you did for us back then, and when I look at the photos of the work now, I still think of you and still am grateful for your volunteer effort and the qualities you brought as a photographer.
Oh, happy to help. But yeah, you were really ahead of your time with that one, Bernie, as I think you probably have been with all aspects of your career. Now, let me ask, when you first started talking about virtual archaeology and making these 3D models of these important ancient sites, was there resistance? Were people thinking that, that was unnecessary, or was it accepted from the start?
I think, oddly enough, the traditionalists in archaeology and art history, who you might think would put up the resistance because they were stodgy old conservatives, they largely accepted what we were doing. They understood that the digital tools were, new versions of the same old tools they had been trained to use, and yet they were better. They were more accurate, they were faster, they gave a lot more detail. So just to give an example, you have a dumphimeter, which is an old surveying device, and it was basically like a little telescope, and the surveyor would peer through it, and a colleague would hold a target over the point on the site that was to be measured. And, the whole process would take at least a couple of minutes to play out, where you would squint through the telescope and find that target and then figure out the distance and write it down. Even in the late 90s, we were able to bring to the site of Horace's Villa a laser scanner, which is able to take hundreds of thousands, now it could be millions of points in a second, all of them more accurate than what those human surveyors were able to achieve. So the people in survey, which is a very conservative, not very exciting discipline, they really jumped on board the digital revolution. And who resisted? Well, it was the more of the humanists who prided themselves on being theoreticians, on being therefore smarter and doing more exciting things than anybody else. They were the ones who, maybe because they sensed that this would give new life and impetus to the conservative methods of their humanist colleagues, they were the ones who resisted, expressed doubt, and so on. But they were in a phase, luckily, I think we've passed through that phase of hyperskepticism associated with, a French thinker like Jacques Derrida and his deconstructionism. They had this very hyper skeptical mentality. They weren't only skeptical about what I was doing, but they were skeptical about any positive claim that you might make in understanding, interpreting, explaining a work of art or architecture or literature. And so I think that their resistance to what I was doing was just a natural extension of their resistance to any idea that in the humanities an expert could obtain solid, reliable results and new knowledge. They were into this mode of thought that you can know nothing about the past. You could never interpret what Shakespeare was trying to achieve in a play like Hamlet or whatever, because all we can do in studying the past is project ourselves onto the past. We can discover ourselves, but we can't discover Shakespeare. And I was saying, even back then in the 1970s, when I was in a theory group that was reading the works of Derrida, that first of all, if I thought that this were true, I never would have bothered to go into the humanities. It was precisely the search for new knowledge and the chance to make new discoveries that motivated me to get into the field, but also that I thought this would kill the humanities, because I thought that if you have a field where even the leading lights are saying there's nothing new and everything we thought we knew, we don't really know, and all we can do is, in effect, discover ourselves or project ourselves onto the great monuments of the past. What young people are going to go into a career like that? So when we talk about today the crisis of the humanities, and there's a lot of talk about that, there have even a couple of books in recent years about the crisis of the humanities. I think that the seeds for the crisis were planted in the 1970s and 80s with deconstructionism, and now we're reaping the terrible crop of failure and pessimism that the humanists themselves planted back then. But I just kept plugging away, very optimistic that eventually quality will out, and if you make discoveries and do new things, that work will be eventually recognized. And I certainly recognized and felt that post-structuralism, deconstructionism would fade away as most modish things do, and that the tried and true perennial methods of hard work and finding out new facts, putting them together to form new theories, that would trump the modish theories of the day. And since deconstructionism has pretty much, as I said, faded away, leaving behind, unfortunately, the crisis of the humanities in its wake, I think that is the case. And I also think that virtual heritage and the digital humanities generally, which really, as I'm suggesting, represent conservatism in the humanities, a conservative approach. That yes, you can understand the past, not just yourself, that gives us hope going forward for the revival of the humanities, as I think does the fact that we're now in the age of artificial intelligence with the sudden appearance on the scene of apps like ChatGPT. And we've already seen leading thinkers in the public sphere, like, say, David Brooks, predicting that the humanities will make a comeback. Because what should a young person now study going to college? Probably not computer programming or something that seemed very practical and to ensure a long, prosperous career like accounting, because these AIs are going to, replace the humans who do that. Instead, you should study humans, and you should study what makes humans different, and you should understand the theoretical, that's to say, the philosophical basis of AI, and the characteristics that will serve the young person well in the 21st century in the age of AI. I think could largely overlap with, they certainly align very well with the humanities. So I'm very hopeful that the humanities will get out of this crisis and have a revival sometime soon. I'm sorry for the long answer.
No, I love that answer and hearing all the background. But yes, I mean, I have always thought that the humanities and the sciences really are just opposite sides of a coin, and you really can't have one without the other. And as far as AI goes, yeah, there's all this talk of, well, the AI art bots, such as Midjourney, for example, is that going to take jobs away from artists? And I feel like no, it's going to expand it even more because you still need the human side. You need the ideas, the innovations. And I do feel like hopeful that the humanities are going to have a resurgence now.
Yes, we used to talk about two kinds of AI, just AI and then human in the loop AI. And as I'm reading about the new large language model forms of AI, I'm not seeing human in the loop talked about. But I agree with you. That's what we would call what you described, where the human is using this new tool to do things better than he or she might have done without the tool, but also to get more out of the tool and to really, push its limits and therefore its development, and maybe even to break it and to show, what the AI can do, but what the AI also cannot do and what you still need humans to do.
And I think that we can do more and more with AI. For example, I use several AI tools to help me make this podcast and edit it faster. As somebody who's super busy with multiple jobs, I wouldn't be able to get these ideas out if it wasn't for AI tools.
Good, brava.
Mhm.
I mean, that's exactly. I think what we all should be doing is, like in my company, my little company, we're going to have an AI week this summer when things calm down, and everybody on the team will take on an AI project, and by the end of the week, present it to everybody else, and there'll be some critiquing. We'll read some theoretical pieces to get the background down. We'll look at some YouTube videos to catch up with all the plethora of great tools that are suddenly out there. There are already hundreds of them, and we try to get a handle on it and see how we can work it into our workflow in the company.
Oh, how fun. Now, you always had a lot of teaching responsibilities at the universities you worked at, as well as doing research and writing. How did you balance all of those roles?
Well, first of all, I tried to align my research interests of the moment with what I was teaching whenever possible. And that, that's not something that I invented. I did my doctoral work in Germany, and in Germany, that was completely normal that the professor would teach exactly what he or she was researching at the moment. In American education, where we have the idea of general ed requirements, ideally they'd be taught by the full professors, and I was always very happy to teach them. There, you're teaching very broad general introductory courses for freshmen and sophomores, and you can't teach in good conscience anyway. I mean, you can always teach what you're researching on, but maybe you shouldn't. Maybe you should do your duty and start from the beginning in presenting the subject to beginners. I also had to do that all along. And I didn't mind doing that because if you only teach what you're working on at the moment, you run the risk of becoming what the Germans, I love this term, called a Fachidiot, a specialized idiot. So, a narrow specialist who knows more and more about less and less. The good thing about those general ed courses is that they, reacquaint you with the big, broad issues and questions and facts and personalities and whatnot of your field, and they keep a breath to your thinking and remind you of all sorts of things which, when you're just focusing on your narrow research of the moment, you will tend to forget. And so there can be a cross fertilization between those broad general things that you may think you don't want to teach and what you're actually researching, which you think is what you want to teach. There can be a back and forth there. And of course, you can always take your narrow research interests and try to work them into even those broad general courses. But you have to do that keeping perspective and not letting them take over the entire course. But maybe they could be the subject of one lecture to show the students, you know, what an advanced scholar is working on in this big field that you're presenting to them.
Well, and speaking of some of your interests, you mentioned that you were so interested in cinema when you were younger. And the first class I took with you was Classics 42 at UCLA, which was cinema and ancient Rome, I believe.
I think Hollywood in the ancient world, we called it.
Ah,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah, I was
And
one of the first in the field of classical studies to teach such a course. I wasn't the first, but one of the first, and I was lucky to be in Los Angeles at the time, and I was able to use the great Margaret Herrick library of the Motion Picture Academy, which made researching movies like the Three Ben-Hurs or the Cleopatras and so on very, very easy. You could go over to the Margaret Herrick Library, ask for all the press clippings of a certain movie, and they would just bring files and file folders of press clippings and other useful research materials. So that something I had a lot of fun doing. And for me, the main purpose of teaching Hollywood in the ancient world was to use it as a way to get students interested in studying the ancient world by sort of piggybacking on popular entertainment. These movies were very popular, very successful, and most of them were old, so they had been forgotten, and they were therefore kind of news to the students. They hadn't seen them before, but if they were well made, they have a certain, eternal appeal. And I could make use of that to get students interested in studying the ancient world. And it is true that most of these movies were not made with the help of any historians who had any kind of decision making power. There may have been some historians consulted, but they didn't have the final say. And so they were riddled with errors, but that's exactly what made the course, pedagogically useful, is you could assign students a task of reading the ancient sources on, say, Cleopatra, and then critiquing the movie from a historical point of view. Maybe they've never heard. I doubt if it's that nobody's ever heard of Cleopatra. I would hope most young people have even heard of Cleopatra or Julius Caesar, but they might not be able to date them. They might not understand when they lived and why they did what they did, or even some of the main things that they did, they may not be familiar with. So the movies get you started, arouse that curiosity to learn more. And the first way to do that, I thought, was to encourage students to take a critical stance toward what's in the movie so they could separate the movie's presentation from what the historical sources and what contemporary historians think really happened.
Yeah, and it was really popular. I remember it would get waitlisted every single time you offered it.
Yeah, I offered another course where I did something similar, Introduction to Roman Civilization, which we called Classics 20 at UCLA. And that had as many as 507 students. That was the most we could ever pack into a room. In that one, I used the I, Claudius BBC series, which was absolutely splendid in terms of its production values, but it came out in the mid 1970s. And by the mid 1980s into the 90s, when I was using it, students had forgotten about it. And we didn't have the internet back then, and we didn't have Netflix. So I had to get it on videotape and project it in the classroom. And a colleague, Ron Malor, in history, the history department of UCLA, had put together a textbook for using iCloudius as a resource in a course much like my Classics 20. And the students absolutely loved it. And I can prove that they loved it because after the final exam, I told all the students, come back in a half hour, take a break and come back. And I'll show you my favorite episode of iCloudius that we were not able to cover in the course. And almost all of the students came back to see it. By the way, it's the 10th episode with the assassination of Caligula, who was played by John Hurt, as I recall. And it was absolutely marvelous and compelling television. So I do think that using popular culture and its treatment of the past is an entry point to get students and the general public interested in the past on a scholarly level is a really effective technique. And you could say that that's really what I'm trying to do in the company, is use new media like virtual reality to spread knowledge and understanding and appreciation of the ancient world.
I remember that. I took Classics 20 with you, and I remember loving iCloudius. Now I'm going to have to go back and watch episode 10 again.
Okay, you have a treat in store.
You and I have talked a lot about the years about how we get inspiration for our different projects, but how do you get your inspiration for new avenues of research and stay interested enough to keep working on it?
I'm an intuitive type. At the advice of a colleague at Indiana University, I took the Myers-Briggs personality assessment and I came back INFJ, which is very introverted and intuitive. So I can't really tell you how I get interested. It's just things occur to me, connections are made, I guess, in my unconscious mind. I get wrapped up in them and I pursue them as far as I can take them. So I don't have a method and I don't have even a conscious program of topics, research topics that I'm pursuing. They just sort of seem to bubble up, as I say, out of the unconscious. And I'm sort of enraptured by them and I follow them where they lead me.
No, that makes sense. I call them bolts of lightning, where all of a sudden something just pops into your head. And that's how I work
Yeah.
too.
Yes. That's why in a way I felt dishonest being a professor because I always felt I really don't have anything to profess except intuition. And the only thing I could say is I suppose the more you know, the more that's down there in your unconscious, the more intuitions or interesting intuitions you will have. So just study a lot of
Yeah.
as much as you can and sit back and wait for that magical moment to that magical bolt of lightning to occur.
You mentioned that since you've started all of your virtual archaeology work, that it's helped other researchers make new discoveries on sites that they had been working on for a long time. Is there maybe one story you could share with us?
Yes, I can share the story of a researcher who was working on a feature of Hadrian's villa, the government retreat. It was kind of like the Camp David of the Roman government in the second century of our era. It's located in Tivoli, and you can still visit it today. There's a great archaeological park there with the standing ruins. Adjacent to the park, there's a private property, and on that property, there are a couple of other fascinating features of Hadrian's villa. One of them was a theater, and that theater has been, since it's on private property, been really very little studied compared to the parts of the villa in the public park. And I know a scholar who got interested in it, and in reading through the very small scholarly literature that preceded her, she found an idea that has been repeated again and again for centuries that, in contrast to most theaters, Hadrian and the elite members of the audience did not sit in the front row as we would expect from Greek and Roman theater design, but actually at the very upper part of the seating in a special area where there was an imperial box, allegedly. That was the theory. And she was dubious, and she made a computer model of the theater, put it into acoustic software, and showed that the alleged area of the imperial box was a dead area acoustically. So it would have been just about the worst place to sit and watch a play, at least if you really were interested in what the actors were saying. Whereas, not unexpectedly, the best place acoustically was in the front row, which is where we know emperors and other members of the elite typically did sit. So, since the theory of that imperial box was just a theory, there was absolutely no evidence supporting it. She felt that she could say that the virtual archaeological approach definitively refuted that older theory and put the emperor back in the first row where he belonged.
I love that. That's so interesting. Yeah, she really proved it.
I think as she proved it as well as you can prove anything, that happened so long ago and for which there's so little evidence that survives. Yeah, she proved it, taking that into account.
Yeah. We're going to switch gears for a second. And I want to know if there was something useful a mentor taught you or told you back when you were training.
Well, I've been watching out of the corner of my eye the growth of the concept of mentorship and the emphasis on it over the last 10 or 20 years. But, I go back in terms of being a student to the 1960s. So that's like 60 years now. And back then, we didn't talk at all, I would say, about mentors and mentorship. I'm glad we do now, and I think it's really important. So, my senior professors were viewed as sort of gods, that we put them on a pedestal. They were very distant and we admired their erudition, but we didn't know them as individuals. And we never would have thought of, bringing a problem to them, whether personal or even professional. They were just remote figures. But that said, if we think of what mentorship is, which is a senior person kind of going out of his or her way to offer advice to a younger person, I did get advice like that. It was absolutely critical. So, for example, when I did my junior year in Germany, I was taken under the wing of the most senior Hellenist of the university, so a professor of Greek literature and Greek philosophy named Wolfgang Schadewald. And he had just come back from a trip to the United States and was very impressed with it. And I was 19 years old and just a junior in college. He invited me to participate in his Oberseminar, and his seminar for professors. So this met every 2 weeks in the evening and went on until the early hours of the morning. And his former students, now professors, would take the train in to this little university town called Tübingen in southwest Germany and study with him and each other. And there I was. I didn't even have a BA, and I was in that very august company. Well, Professor Schadewald got to know me and invited me to lunch once, which unforgettably, I still remember that. And at a certain point, he asked us what I was doing, and I told him that I was writing a paper. He asked to see it, and he said, "You should publish it." And so I published my first paper when I was 19 years old. It came out when I was 20. And that paper really launched my career. It just had all kinds of unexpected, unintended effects that led to, this or that fellowship and jobs and everything. I mean, I had to publish other things, but it really was the sort of first stage rocket ship of my career. And that was just Professor Shadowalt going out of his way to do what you would now call mentor me. And I'm really grateful to him for that. Another example would be my professor of Latin in college. I visited him when I graduated in Rome, and he, spontaneously, knowing that I was there for the first time, offered to take me on a walking tour of the historic center of Rome. And that I can trace my love of Rome and my obsession with the history of Rome back to that walking tour that he gave me. And I could give you many other examples of how teachers just sort of spontaneously went out of their way to do what we would now call mentor me, even though we didn't really have that concept back then. And they didn't do as much of that kind of thing as we try to do today.
But I feel like it's so important and just those little things where you felt special and you thought, "Oh, if this person thinks I have something to say, then I must have something to say."
Yes. Yeah. I think that feeling of being special that, again, what we now call a mentor can give you as a young person is really crucial, because otherwise you're just, faceless student in the throng of your fellow students.
Yes, and at a big university, you could just disappear easily.
Yes, and we don't want that to happen. We want everybody is the center of the universe. Everybody, whenever I pass through a crowd of people, I think, isn't it amazing? Everybody views themselves as the center of the entire universe and the most important person who ever lived. And I don't say that mockingly. I mean, I think that's why we respect individuals and individuality. And as teachers, we need to always think of our students that way, as a center of a universe who, we can impact. We can make that center, a better place, let us say, to stick with
Yes.
that metaphor.
Yeah. Is there anything that you would have told your younger self?
I think there is. I've often thought about it, and it's something I do tell my students. I already mentioned that according to Myers Briggs, I'm very introverted. And so all through my careers, but especially when I was young, I always had this idea quality will out, that if you do good work, it'll be recognized. You don't have to promote it. And I always felt that there was something kind of distasteful about self promotion, which I guess goes along with my introverted character. But I do see that, yes, quality is very important, but networking is equally important. And you really need to, even for the sake of your work, to do it fair justice. You need to put it in front of people who matter. And there's nothing wrong with that. They matter because they're scholars in that very field and they should be interested in it, whether they agree with it or not. And there's and they're inundated. They're also the center of the universe. They also have a lot on their plate. And there's no reason why they should ever encounter what you are doing, what you have published. And so it's okay to bring it to their attention. And bringing it to their attention can open a colloquy, it can open up a dialogue with them. And that's very good to know more and more people, to get to know the people they know, and to cooperate, collaborate with others, not just sit in your study thinking your great thoughts and writing your great writings, but get out and network. And that I tell students that. And if I had done that, I think my career would have been very different. I think that, to especially if you take into account the fact that I got my PhD in Germany, not in the United States, but my career was in the United States. I can see, having been a professor over 45 years now, that if you look at, like, just go through and look at the faculty of various departments, and you'll see a clustering of graduate schools. These people have known each other their whole professional lives. They went to the same graduate school. Not all of them, but there's always a kind of a dominant school. And they live together, they study together, and now they want to work together. Well, having gotten my degree in Germany, I was completely outside of the American system. So for me, as a young person, networking in America should have been a very high priority. And unfortunately, it was not a priority at all.
I think that's really good advice. And I do feel like you managed to impart that to me because as soon as I started writing and publishing, I was going to every conference and presenting everything and trying to get out there. And I feel like you're one of the people that encouraged me to do that.
Well, thanks for saying that. I hope it's true, but it is, and I don't know if I was already doing it when you were a student, but I certainly do it now here at Indiana University, where I have my own doctoral program that I started, and a lot of doctoral students. I encourage them to do exactly what you did.
So, how would you describe your mentoring style now?
Well, it's like I was saying about my professing style. I don't know if I have a style, certainly not a method. I'm always a very intuitive person. I think my mentoring style is that, and again, going back to that idea of respecting the individual and thinking of the individual as the center of the world, and a center that could be improved in some way. I want to serve them as best I can. I do that in an official capacity when they are formally in a class. I read what they write, I mark it up, I give it back to them as quickly as I can. But after the class is over, if they're still in my orbit, if they're, a doctoral student in my program, for example, somehow, again, it's like those lightning bolts that strike you coming out of your unconscious. If I haven't heard from a student, I start to worry. It just suddenly it emerges into my consciousness. Hey, I haven't heard from this person or that person in a while. I better check and see how they're doing and see if they need any help or guidance. So again, I would say I'm a very intuitive person, and I let my intuition tell me when I need to take action. And of course, if on the other hand, if the student, now that we live in the age of mentoring, takes advantage of my availability as a mentor, then I don't have to take the initiative. I can just be there passively and then try to get into their train of thought, try to put myself into their shoes and see the world the way they do and understand the problem they have. I try to, use whatever little bit of psychology that I understand. And psychology is something that I've studied a bit and applied in some of my research papers, and try to help people see that they have a certain kind of habitual behavior or attitude that may be holding them back, and bring that into their awareness so they can get over that hurdle, and it won't hold them back anymore. By raising the awareness, they can overcome the problem. So I would say, putting it all together, I've been rambling, but that's just a sign of how undisciplined and intuitive my approach to mentoring is. I would say that's what I would have to say about myself as a mentor.
Well, that's very interesting because I was thinking about, what actually your mentoring style is since now you've mentored me for how many years? 25 years or something. I'm your longest student to date, probably.
I think we've switched roles, and you've been mentoring me for about the last 15 years of the 25.
No way. But you do have a very intuitive style. So your style is, I would say, intuitive, open door policy. So I always knew that I could come to you anytime if I needed something. And then also, you've always been a big connector, connecting people with each other that you think could somehow, you're always like, you need to talk to this person. Or I remember one time I came to you saying, well, I want to do research in a biology lab. And you said, oh, well, here you go. This is my friend. I'm going to contact him. And next thing you know, I'm working in a lab. And then the intuition part, I remember when I finished my first season of the dig at Horace's Villa. And from age 6 on, all I wanted to do was be an archaeologist. And at the end of that season, you pulled me aside and you said, look, you know, I don't think you should be an archaeologist. I think you need to work with the living and not the dead. Have you thought about medicine? And that changed everything. That changed the whole course of my life, Bernie.
Huh. Well,
You maybe you
that's
don't even remember saying that.
I don't, but I remember other interactions with you. But if I said that, I guess I'm happy. I mean, we could have used you in archaeology, but I think you've done a lot more good for the world through medicine, and I'm very proud of you, and I can't believe how far you've taken it. So bravo to you. And it's so much fun for a teacher to stay in touch with their former students, not just for a year or two, to write that extra, recommendation they may need for the next step in their career, but for their whole lives, and to see their children, to see their careers, see their career choices, and then see how that works out for them. And in your case, it's worked out brilliantly.
Yeah, and you could always tell when I was bored by something or needed something extra. Even in college, you would give me side projects. One of them, you made me read Guns, Germs, and Steel by Jared Diamond,
Oh
which
yeah.
was amazing. And we had so many side projects. And then during COVID, you actually really helped me get through some of those worst months working in the hospital because we started our own side book club where we would read books together and then talk about them.
Yeah, that was a lot of fun. You helped me too, having that connection and being able to read broadly as with your encouragement. I think you were the one who chose the topics and very often the books.
Yeah, I chose the books, but some of them were written by classicists.
Yeah, that's true. That is true. We won't go into what we were reading about.
We'll do a whole other podcast episode about that.
Okay.
Now, one of the topics that I like to talk about on this podcast is any recent lessons that somebody is learning or working on. So, are you learning any specific life lessons or have you had anything come up recently?
I'm old now. I'm almost 74. So how many big new fundamental things can you learn? Yet I would say I have learned something in the last year. I went into academia in conscious rebellion against business. My father was a very successful CPA and business advisor, and I always felt implicitly at home when I was growing up an expectation by him and my mother that I would go into his business, take it over, grow it, take it to the next level. But I never was interested in business, and I had a typical, maybe academic or humanist academic attitude toward business and businessmen that it's all about greed. It could be a little bit shady, and that businessmen were very selfish, almost by definition. I had the idea that grew on me in the 2000s and then resulted in action in 2015 that it was important to get the work in virtual heritage I was doing outside of the lab and get it seen by a much broader public than could see it when it was in a university lab, and that the way to do that was by starting a business to commercialize it. And I won't go into all the specific reasons why I started the business. in the summer of 2015, but there was strong motivation because I knew that virtual reality headsets were going to be released to the public in the spring of 2016. And I wanted to be in on that and take advantage of this new mass platform to get our work out. So I started the company. And for a long time, being skeptical about business people, I didn't really talk with any or consult with them or let alone seek investment from them. But in the last 2 years, it turned out to be important for the success of the company to and you could see, by the way, in my approach in 2015, 16, 17, you could see my typical introversion, right? That I wasn't networking. But in the last 2 years, for various reasons, it made sense to network. And I found out that below the surface, I think certainly unbeknownst to academics and probably the general public, there's an enormous number of groups of business people who get together for purely altruistic reasons to help newbies, to help startups, founders of startups like myself. And you can get into the circuit of these groups and they'll invite you to present via Zoom or whatever. And you tell them what you're doing, you tell them your problems, and they just out of the goodness of their heart will tell you how they would approach a solution and just give you wonderful advice, and even in some cases offer to invest in your company, even though 9 out of 10 startups fail, even though those that succeed, it's very often hard to get the money out of a small privately held company. It's not listed on the stock market, so you can't just sell your stock. But there's a lot of altruism in the business community. And I'm glad I learned that lesson but I learned it when I was over 70 years old, having had a very, as I say, typically academic, arrogant and contemptuous attitude toward business people, which I now regret. But as my mother used to say, it's never too late. So that's a lesson I learned.
I didn't know that there was that side of the business world because I too have been in academics. And so that's actually really useful for me to hear.
Good, good. I hope, and your other listeners, I hope some of them, if they had my kind of attitude of arrogance and suspicion, that you will, rethink that and actually start getting to know, business people in your community. And you may find that they are really quite admirable
Well, and
people.
also we're not working in our own silos, in our own little bubbles. We have to be able to translate our ideas out into the world, and whatever way we can get our good ideas out there is going to be valid.
Yes. And, again, that's where networking comes in. You can't do it. You can't do it by yourself. You need a network.
Humans are tribal creatures. We do need that network. We need people around us to support us. We need people that can help us, that we can help in return. And so that's the thing. We're not these individual beings we think we are. We need each other.
I completely agree.
Last but not least, as far as my questions go, I talk a little bit about burnout on this podcast because I've been through it, and I talk about how I got out of it and I'm staying out of it. But in your career, at any point, did you feel either burnout or just tired, like you needed a break from all of it? Or have you been just go, go, go like an Energizer bunny this whole time?
I would say I have been burnt out. I have been depressed and disappointed with my career. And so let me just tell you a little bit how that happened. I was hired, my first job was at UCLA and I was hired in 1976. So before, what we would now call the computer revolution, or at least the personal computer revolution, but really just before, because the first personal computer started coming out in the late 70s. And I got my first personal computer in 1980. So I was hired before the personal computer revolution had occurred to handle some core courses in the classics department at UCLA, which had nothing to do with computing, and which I love teaching and researching, and I still do. But I bought my first personal computer in 1980, and I started using it. And by the mid 80s, I had gotten a grant from the Getty Foundation and started using it computing in a creative way, but in a way that my colleagues found puzzling and surprising, unexpected, and having very little to do with why they hired me. And that problem, I think they thought I was passing through a phase. We talk as a parent, we talk about young kids going through a phase and they'll get over it. I think my colleagues were assuming and hoping I was going through a phase and I would snap back and be the guy they hired in 1976. But it only got worse. And by the late 90s, it got really bad where I was just doing things so unexpected and new because of the support of computing that they didn't know what to do with me. So that's when I went through the crisis and I felt I was putting all my effort into something that is not being rewarded and respected and honored, and they just don't get it. So what did I do? I started, besides being depressed and angry for a year or two, I started looking around for another job that would allow me to align my personal interests with my profession. And it took a few years because there are very few jobs at the senior level in the humanities, and now there are even fewer, unfortunately. We've got to change that. If anyone's listening here wants to endow a chair in English or history or whatever, I encourage you to do so. It's more important now than ever. But a good job opportunity came up in, I think, 2003 to be the head of a digital humanities research center at another university. And I jumped at the opportunity, was lucky enough to be chosen. And, when I got there, I said, I'm now able to make my hobby into my day job and my day job into my hobby. So my day job at UCLA was teaching, classical authors and Roman archaeology. And at this other university, I only had to teach one course a semester, and it was one of those kinds of courses. So that became a kind of hobby. And my day job was running a digital humanities center, which was kind of my dream position. So I think the solution is to try to realign your new personal interests, the thing that has gotten you into a funk, with your professional position. And I was lucky enough to be able to do that. Of course, in an ideal world, you wouldn't have to even leave your current university or your current institution organization to make that realignment. You could be reassigned within the organization. For me, it wasn't possible, unfortunately. And every January, I still ask myself, now, please remind me what fit of madness caused you to leave Los Angeles when you did. That I only have that thought in the depth of winters in January, but by leaving, I was able to grow and develop in new ways. And if I'd stayed and been kept in that 1976 box, I'm sure I would have retired years ago and been very comfortable and everything, but not done a huge amount that I was able to do by leaving.
Well, and you did something very new, novel, pioneering. And so it was good that you were aware that this is what I want to do. How am I going to get it done? And moving was what had to happen.
Yeah, I mean, I love Los Angeles, and I would jump at the opportunity to go back in a second. But I love what I'm doing much, much more. There's no comparison. I do feel you only live once, and you've got to try to really do something important and leave your mark. And that, for me, has always been the driving motivation. And looking back all these years, except for all those Januaries, I'm happy that I was able to continue my development that started when I bought that first personal computer, a K Pro, back in 1980.
Wow. That's really inspiring because I actually didn't know that part of your story. So thank you for sharing it with us.
Oh, you're welcome. Hope it helps someone else.
I think it's definitely going to help at least one person, if not more. Tell us what your company is called and where we can find you.
The company is called Flyover Zone, which maybe I should explain. And the website is www.flyoverzone, all written together, .com. And we're based in Bloomington, Indiana, but we have staff all over the world, well, in 11 countries around the world. Very, very talented and committed, passionate people. And I love working with them. And I learn a lot from them every time we meet. And we meet a lot thanks to teleconferencing software like what we're using now. Everybody works from home. We work remotely. We're a very state of the art kind of company. What we do is we put out two products: a virtual museum with interactive 3D models of sculpture. Right now, we've got 750 classical sculptures. Our mission is to cover the four corners of the earth, so we'll be moving into other periods and cultures with time. The second product is called Yourscape. Your as in days of yore, and scape as in landscape. So this is a platform for going back in time. And we create virtual tours that take you across space to see the ruins in Egypt, Lebanon, Greece, Italy, Mexico, and again, eventually the four corners of the earth. And then back in time to see the ruins spring to life in computer reconstructions. And we make those reconstructions collaborating with the world's leading experts who also help us then to write the scripts that are recorded and performed at the stops of the tours. The stops can be taken in any order you want, just following your curiosity. And the tours last anywhere from 45 minutes to over 3 hours and can be taken on mobile devices, smartphones, tablets, iOS and Android, PCs, Mac and Windows, and VR headsets like the Oculus. And I said I'd explain Flyover Zone. Of course, our headquarters is in Bloomington, Indiana. I always like to say we're so far into the flyover zone that when you look up at the sky, you don't even see any airplanes flying overhead. We're not on any flight. We're not on any flight paths. We're totally forgotten part of the interior of the United States. But it's a great place. It's my favorite community to live in. So I highly recommend Bloomington, Indiana. If anyone has a chance to move here or move their business here, do so. It's a wonderful place to be. And it's a double entendre, though, because we're in the flyover zone of the United States, but also right from the beginning in the early 90s when I started my lab at UCLA to make virtual reality models, we called showing the model to somebody a fly through or a flyover. So, we're a flyover zone in those two senses of the word.
That's great. So the next time that I am traveling to Rome or one of the sites in Mexico, can I use your product to give myself a virtual tour?
You could. You can use it, at home before you even depart to prepare yourself. And then it is a streaming app. So as long as your smartphone, you have it with you when you go to the Roman Forum and you're tuned into the, local cell phone network, which you probably are, you can stream the commentary that will explain what you're seeing in the forum right to your cell phone in the Roman Forum and use it as a sort of a contemporary audiovisual device, an AR device, if you will, an augmented reality device on site.
That's
And yet,
wonderful.
yeah, and we sell individual subscriptions for a very reasonable amount of money. If you go to the website, you can see how to buy an individual subscription. And we also sell annually renewing subscriptions to educational institutions and libraries. And we just started marketing our products in January, and we already have over 550 institutions ranging from elementary schools through, Oxford, Cambridge, Harvard, Yale, higher education that have signed up for our free trial subscription. So we are getting good feedback and buy-in, and I think we're going to be very successful as a company.
Amazing. Well, you're really doing something very novel and useful. So I think it's going to go a long way.
Thank you. Let us hope.
Well, thank you so much, Bernie. This was really fun talking to you.
Thanks again, Patil, for inviting me. It's always wonderful to talk with you, and it's been a pleasure to know you since you were a little girl, and now such a respected senior physician. So thanks again for inviting me.
Thank you. Please like, subscribe, share, and download the podcast. And again, you can find us at Human School Podcast on Instagram. I'd like to thank Dr. Zac Efron for the theme music of our podcast. And I'd just like to make a general disclaimer that any of the institutions I work for, including Community Regional Medical Center, UCSF Fresno, and American Ambulance, have nothing to do with any of my thoughts or opinions. And so we'll kindly leave them out of this. Thanks, everyone. See you next time.